You made it to the Go Commando Show with Fred Galvin. On our new mission, we contend with the naked truths of health, leadership, and overcoming adversity. Now it's time to go commando.
Welcome back, Commandos. This is our second of a three-part series featuring a guest who's become a close friend of mine over the last 10 years, and that is retired Marine Corps officer who retired as a Lieutenant Colonel, Steve Morgan. And Lieutenant Colonel Morgan served as a panel member. It's also known in many worlds as a jury member. Steve was on the jury in 2008 when the unit that I commanded, which was a Marine Special Operations Task Force deployed into Afghanistan, was falsely accused of killing 19 and wounding 50 Afghan civilians. So the preliminary investigation, which was conducted by an Air Force colonel, had recommended that we be charged with one of the allegations was Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is homicide and carries the max penalty of death. And so Lieutenant Colonel Morgan was one of the senior officers that was selected and presided over that trial that occurred in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and where I was sent to trial. And he will explain what he saw before going into the court, from everything that was sensationalized in the news to what he heard in over 3.5 weeks of testimony, and what he's been active since the trial in looking out for the welfare of the Marines who have been affected by those false allegations. So very interesting for leaders to listen to this podcast, especially those who have gone through something that may have been unjust and maybe doing some type of campaigning and coordination at various levels to right a wrong. So without any further delay, Lieutenant Colonel Morgan will discuss his perspective and experiences during the Court of Inquiry from 2008. Commandos, we have a great show for you right now. And again, as you've possibly watched the last two podcasts with Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, retired Marine Corps officer, and myself, we've brought to you podcasts on the George Washington's winter encampment and his trials during the winter of 1777 and 1778. We'll also talk to you about his military career that spanned 3 decades. And now we're going to talk to you about how our paths originally crossed in the Marine Corps, which was during 2008. And the company that I commanded for the Marine Special Operations was able to take a task force into Afghanistan. And during that time, we were involved in a combat situation. There were no casualties on the American side. We were ambushed in a complex ambush, shot and returned and killed the enemy that was shooting at us. And immediately thereafter, information went out on the World Wide Web and across many media sources that painted the picture into many, not just American military, but congressional leaders, and even to the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, who were claiming that we killed Afghan civilians, specifically women and children primarily, but said we killed 19 and wounded 50. And that led into a very deliberate preliminary investigation, which he will talk about. And this is unrehearsed, completely unrehearsed. I'm just going to let him talk about how the chronology of that. But we went into a preliminary investigation the Air Force colonel had handled, and he will discuss that because he read every page of that, and that was turned over to the Marine Corps by their convening authority of that commanding general of Special Operations Command Central of every Special Operations officer or enlisted personnel in the Middle East. That was turned over to the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps decided to have the Marine Central all the commanding general in charge of all the Marines in the Central Command, the Middle East area of operation, which at that time was then Lieutenant General James Mattis, who's now the Secretary of Defense. And it started a criminal investigation, which they used 45 criminal investigators to look at every angle that for the entire life cycle of our company that I commanded. And that led to the determination that they're going to utilize a specific court, which is akin to a grand jury, called a Court of Inquiry. The last time it had been used was back in 1950, I believe, 6. So it was a very rarely used case, and it was determined to utilize this process instead of a court-martial, since there was no prima facie evidence. It was more serious than a Article 32 hearing, which many Marines had encountered up at this point in 2006 and 2007 and 2008. Some of the other war crimes trials, mainly in Iraq, but ours was very serious allegations, but there was no evidence, such as bodies or a photograph of a body, so they utilized a court of inquiry due to the lack of prima facie evidence and the seriousness of the matter. It was because the prime minister of a country, the head of a state, created some things into play. Some senior Army officers had made some allegations. The Marine Corps wanted to show it's taking this as seriously as it possibly could, and it led to what I had just described, with that number of criminal investigators looking at every angle. And it also determined from the convening authority, Lieutenant General Mattis at that time, that there would be 3 senior officers who would, one of the requirements is that they had combat experience. So that's not just people who went over to combat, it's Marine officers who had faced the enemy, and not just gone to the theater. And Lieutenant Colonel Morgan was one of those officers. So if you have not listened to his career and how he had served in combat, please listen to that in the previous episode. But I'm going to start off. Sir, welcome to the show again. And please, if you could describe how you were initially notified and what that notified that you were going to be in the Court of Inquiry. Like I described, they were looking for combat officers, which there had been a number of combat experienced officers at this time in 2008 or 2007 in the Marine Corps, but we'd been fighting at that time for 7 years in Afghanistan and since 2003, so for 4.5 years in Iraq, and you were chosen as one of the 3, and that you ended up getting a read-ahead material and studying about this case. What was that like when you first were notified?
Well, yeah, just real quick, just a couple of corrections for Fred. You did have one Marine. You had said no Americans injured.
Oh, we did have one Marine wounded in his right bicep with shrapnel. I'm sorry.
One I'm thinking. Or
Senior moment.
Yeah. So there was one Marine wounded. And just for clarity, a court of inquiry is analogous to a civilian grand jury. And so you can, the rules are a little bit loose, but you can come in and get testimony, and the members of the jury can in this case, the members of the board of the Court of Inquiry can just jump in and ask any kind of questions whenever they want. There's no waiting for the judge to say this or that, and actually there is no judge. It's grand jury. So it's just analogous to that, just to make the Court of Inquiry a little bit easier to understand. Spoiler alert, before we go any further too, I'll answer Fred's question in just a second. First of all, so spoiler alert, Fred Galvin and his 6 Marines, call them the MARSOC 7, they are not guilty of any war crimes accusations, period, end of story. So it's a fight that's still being fought, but Fred Galvin and his Marines are not guilty of any war crimes. Look at me, not guilty. So, Fred, to answer your question, I was sitting at my desk one day, I got this piece of paper, and it said the command had to nominate several officers who met the criteria to sit on this court of inquiry. I was one of them, and myself and Colonel Bart Sloat from my command. We were two that were chosen, and then there were a whole list of questions on there: combat experience, time in the service, MOS, what your experience in combat was, decorations, just kind of your standard questions for the military, and so a lot of it had to match up what Fred and his subordinates, the people that were accused. So they were trying to find a peer group. You couldn't just bring people that had never seen or heard a shot fired in anger and come in and understand the intricacies. But it was also the fact that we had all had experience in Afghanistan, and I think one of the other board members may have been to Iraq. But the point was, the questionnaire just had to kind of, and so when they sorted things out, it was kind of matching up what Fred and the other Marines, what their experience in Afghanistan was, and they were looking for people that had not necessarily a completely similar experience, but had an understanding of the situation on the ground, and so that we could approach it from that angle. And so that's, that was it. And then, I think that, initially we were supposed to start off in December, and there was a delay, and we ended up starting off in January of 2008.
Yes.
And so
that was due to the security clearances of some of the lawyers.
Civilian lawyers, yeah.
We actually were brought into a room on a Friday night, and they wanted to start 10 days later, and that was not possible due to some of the matters that were classified. So that we did end up pushing that till after the holidays, and actually it's right around almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In 2000.
About 10 years.
8.
Wow.
This is almost 2018 now. By the time you see it, it will be. And but there had been a lot of information out before this time and before the trial that you'd heard in the media.
Oh, yeah, my word. Yeah, listen, it was, and I had a special interest. If you look at the other podcasts, I've always had a special interest in special operations, and I was really interested in watching. I didn't know Fred from Adam, but I was really interested in watching the progress of MARSOC and how they grew and matured. So when this incident out in Afghanistan happened, I thought, well, okay, what in the world's going on? And by all appearances in the newspaper, several newspaper and a couple of televised media reports and just stuff out there, it's like these guys had Fred and his Marines had shot up eastern Afghanistan like a bunch of drunken tequila besotted cowboys.
And these weren't just members of the media; these were senior.
Oh no, there were senior
army officers, members of Congress.
Exactly. You had people, trying convicting and hopefully sentencing Fred and his Marines in a public forum for anything, before the dust even got settled. So you had, and I'll be honest with you, and it's like there were so many reports, and they all put such a cast. I thought, yeah, these guys have probably really screwed up. I thought these guys were guilty, which, it didn't take me long to start hearing some testimony in the court of inquiry. Wait a minute, these guys aren't guilty. They've they're being set up by Keystone cops, and it was, I don't mean to sit here and laugh. I'm not laughing at Fred or his predicament with his, in the Marines, because that's not funny. But the incompetence that was displayed, on really a vast scale from people that you expected a lot more. I mean, service academy graduates who had been in the military, a lot of them for 20 plus years. You would have just expected better. And we got we didn't get our money's worth from those people.
Now, from your service in Afghanistan, you've probably seen situations where the Afghans there's an enemy that we're fighting over there. And of course, sometimes they're going to say, when it comes down to a he said, she said event, that, there's going to be two sides of the story. Obviously, there's the enemy and we're their enemy. But once that was kind of done and over with, and it got handed to first the Army, and they preferred it for charges to NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. These were, in this decision to proceed forward with a court of inquiry where it's supposed to be, quote unquote, by the JAG instructions, fair, impartial, and unbiased. From what you read, both in the preliminary investigation that an Air Force officer conducted and turned into the Army, and then later that the Naval Criminal Investigative Service had read or had conducted interviews in what the court, the convening authority, at that time, General Mattis, had said it's supposed to be fair, impartial, and biased. What was your concept of, once you started to review these documents and hear some testimony, if the preliminary investigation or NCIS and then the testimony, did they mesh, or was it fair, impartial, and biased, or what was your...
Well, there were so many inconsistencies in the investigative documents that we saw, and especially once there were read-aheads, but once you started reading the stuff that was classified, you just looked at these things, and just even you not comparing one document produced by, say, NCIS or another document produced by, the Air Force officer assigned to investigate the matter, not by comparing one to the other, because you're always going to get some cross. You read the Air Force officer's document. His document contradicted itself. We don't have time to go into all the details, and some of it's technically still classified, but he was reaching conclusions that he wanted to reach in his document, and the body of his document contradicted the conclusions of his document. In NCIS, you could see they were just going after, they were fishing to catch a fish, and they didn't care how they did it, And I found the NCIS investigation rather repulsive, just from the point of view that they were fishing to catch a fish just to catch a fish, but the fisherman was a Marine and the fish was a Marine. And to me, it's just, there's something wrong with that in the first place, but then to behave that way, but then to do that to a brother Marine, that was repulsive. As it turned out, the examples I'm using with the Air Force, that guy didn't know what he was talking. It was just an amateurish attempt to find a scapegoat and to make a path forward to get the answers that would correctly fit the question that they were asking. So there was nothing fair or impartial about most of the investigatory documents that we saw. The later matter, there's two matters here, one that's still rather classified. That was fair. But the big thing that we're talking here about the MARSOC 7, there wasn't anything fair or impartial. They weren't.
No, the MARSOC 7's main thing was the alleged killing. And that's what General Conway, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps at that time, gave his 14 August 2007 Consolidated Disposition Authority letter to General Mattis to investigate the 4th of March, which was, as it specifically stated, the ambush in Nangarhar Province on that day when we got ambushed. But so the process that you were looked at and selected for, as far as being, experienced combat on the ground compared to the preliminary investigator.
He had no combat experience. He was an Air Force, combat controller, but he had no combat experience. His knowledge of American small arms and weaponry was nil to limited. The guy, it was a completely inappropriate choice to go out and do an investigation because he didn't know the questions to answer. See, frankly, I think he did know the questions to ask. The questions he asked were in order to get somebody in trouble because they were, they didn't want you guys around. But he was the wrong person to send there to do the investigation because he wasn't qualified. His knowledge of ground combat operations was marginal, and he had zero combat experience. He had only fired a round downrange at the range.
And so many people have asked me over the years about motive. I'm not a criminal investigator background at all, but I think so many people try to figure out why somebody in the military would even think about doing that to somebody else in the military, and what would you rationalize as far as him or someone in that chain of command?
No, well, Fred, in your instance, that was politics, plain and simple. That was. We talked a little bit, and I just want to emphasize, it's not an Army Marine Corps thing. There's some discussion about the Marine Corps blames it on the Army. No, it isn't. This is about Special Operations Command not wanting the Marine Corps to play because it was going to suck money away from them in some way, shape, or form, and it was just something else for them to deal with. And now, mind you, that for the most part, Special Operations Command is Army-centric, but that's not the point from the point of view as it's Army against Marine Corps. It's about Special Operations Command. So you had that, and then you had this other factor where Fred was in a very jointy environment. And he had it's not even worth going into, complicated chain of command structure, but there, the conventional combat commander was an Army colonel who had a task force called Task Force Spartan. And Fred was, part of some of Fred's operation took place in that guy's so-called battle space. It's an Army term, not a Marine Corps term. So, but he was closely affiliated with the Special Operations Command gang. And he was, a political climber. and the command at Special Operations Command, the general commanding that was a political climber himself, and both he and this Task Force Spartan commander had good history, if you will. And so it was less it's not an Army Marine Corps thing, it's a Special Operations thing, and the Marine Corps, was an unwanted bastard child in their household. Now, I will say this. The Marine Corps let the Marine Corps Special Operations Command down because we, as in corporate Marine Corps, we didn't want them. Donald Rumsfeld forced MARSOC on the Marine Corps. And so by letting MARSOC down, corporate Marine Corps let MARSOC down, they let Fred and his Marines down. So the Marine Corps rightfully takes some blame for the harm that they've done. I call it a moral injury to Fred, but especially to his Marines. So it's SOCOM politics and Marine Corps recalcitrance that Fred's ended up in this pickle with his Marines, and then you have all these really, it's almost like a make believe. It's so strange, the incompetence of. I call it a perfect storm of officer incompetence that just somehow seem to, come together in this little tight, black hole of a grease ball and sucked Fred and his Marines into this thing. But I can, even to this day, I cannot believe the lack of officer integrity on a whole bunch of levels, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force. I can't believe the behavior of NCIS, especially since, it was Marines assigned to the NCIS behaving unethically toward other Marines just in order to get, to make a case to bring charges. There was all kinds of bad stuff, from my personal opinion is that the Task Force Spartan commander, my personal opinion is that he perjured himself. I think that he was an incompetent combat leader, which is probably why he got promoted, the Peter Principle. I think he only looked out for himself and himself only because he was so worried about getting promoted. And he was so incompetent that when he was confronted with evidence that Fred had permission to be where he was, he had no idea that Fred had permission until a year later, when one of the members of the Court of Inquiry confronted him with it. Here's your operations order. Major Galvin had permission to operate in that area on that day, on that time, to go there and do this and come back. At the time, this officer was screaming at the top of his lungs like a damn fool that Fred was operating like a cowboy and running amok down the streets of some village in Kandahar Province, Nangarhar Province, shooting up the village elders. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then he was stunned to see that Fred had permission. Well, he didn't even take the time, take the 5 minutes it would have taken him to walk into his operations center and say, let me see the operations order for Major Galvin's mission out to Torkham. was out to Torkham, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I mean, and so that's what you were dealing with, that kind of individual who was had some sort of command or control or whatever he thought he had of Fred and his Marines operating his battle space. And I know you want to ask me another question, Fred, but I just got to get this out. My personal opinion of the guy was that, he had been over there for too long. He had made too many wrong decisions that got too many of his own men killed. He had the highest at the time, and probably still holds the highest casualty rate, especially of KIA, of any Army unit in the Afghan theater during the whole time that we've been over there. And yeah, I just think he was at the point where he could not make good decisions anymore, yet he continued to remain in command. So you were dealing with that kind of leadership, and that's only one example. There's a whole lot more, but this is the one particular one that drives me crazy and just fills me with loathing and disgust.
Not a question, some comments to amplify to the listeners. Some of you that have not heard the whole background on the story, there's plenty you can web search out there under MARSOC 7 or Marine Special Operations, Fox Company. But what Colonel Morgan was just describing is the perfect storm to provide some additional details. This was the very first command that the Marine Corps was ordered since they'd started the Special Operations Command in 1987. That was a combination of Navy SEALs, Green Berets, Army Rangers, and some Air Force Special Operations units. Marine Corps sat it out. It said, we're going to retain our own elite units from reconnaissance and force reconnaissance. And we, as Marines, were all special. So the Marines bypassed in 1987, and for over 20 years had done the elite unit activities in the Marine Corps by our own force reconnaissance units, which I was a part of, for Marine units and not the joint world. So when we talk about some kind of things as far as like motive, and now Dr. Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense on his second time as Secretary of Defense after September 11th, 2001, he ordered all of the services to create more capacity. So the Green Berets added additional Green Beret battalions for each group. Navy SEALs added additional SEAL teams. Marine Corps did not want to participate, again, still, but the Secretary of Defense outranks all the uniform members. And so the Marine Corps eventually proposed more staff officers as liaisons to the Special Operations Command in Tampa. That wasn't good enough. They proposed a kind of a slow roll proposal to have a proof of concept, which lasted 3 years and ended, but it was proven that the Marines can perform these special operations by primarily the force reconnaissance and intelligence Marines combined together. They succeeded at doing that in combat in Iraq. And then Dr. Rumsfeld in late 2005 said, thou shalt create a tactical unit permanently in the Special Operations Command. So what that means to our listeners is they formed up a tactical unit, and that was the unit that I was placed in charge of. So if you want to compare, the Special Operations Command at that time was commanded by a 4-star Army general named General Brown, and General Doug Brown, and at the time, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, which I believe at that time was General Hagee, because I saw them both down at Camp Lejeune. So it was like an arranged marriage from a father having his son, and I don't want to refer to services, but having two people married, and basically I was the baby. So if you want to put it in some sick terms that maybe other people can understand. So this was something that the nuptial partners did not really agree with, but it was ordered by the senior family member who's adamant that he's sick and tired of this procrastination. And that's exactly what happened. There was decades of not wanting to be a part of this association. So Donald Rumsfeld said, "Thou shalt." It's like Moses walking down with tablets saying, I'm in charge. This is how it's going to be. And they started our unit. We were the offspring, the very first unit that went downrange, but you still had these two parents that definitely did not want either part of each other. So there was some mindset to, does this have to be, and how long? And maybe President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld will serve one term as the president, and they didn't count on a re-election, which actually is what happened. And so as things happen in the military, the senior person has their way, and Dr. Rumsfeld won, being the Secretary of Defense, and the Marines cooperated. But anyway, we went downrange, and not everybody was so happy. Our first unit, it was supposed to be the first on both deploying units from the Marine Corps from the East and West Coast, were supposed to remain on ships, which is how we deployed overseas. We were told we were not going to get off. And Dr. Rumsfeld had ordered, and the Special Operations Commander had actually previously said that we were. So things were in place, but there was friction in this so-called marriage. So did you see some of this early on from the Marine Corps, your contacts in Special Operations Command, this animosity towards not having the Marines get in, or the Marines?
Well, I saw it. Sitting in the COI, you could discern, that the Army, not the Army, but the excuse me for saying it, it's like, because it's Army centric. It's Army, what Special Operations Command is Army centric, so that's why I kind of say Army. But you could see it at Special Operations Command. Really, they didn't want the Marine Corps. But from personal experience, before I, in a former life in the Marine Corps, I was up at headquarters Marine Corps when all this started. And the section I was assigned to, I was the only guy that even knew how to spell special operations, and just simply because I was curious. And I had a clearance to go to the meetings. So I actually sat in meetings with very senior general officers, operational general officers of the Marine Corps and their colonels. I was at a backbench. I wasn't at the table at the back bench, but you could hear what was being said. And the gist of the conversation was the senior general was like, "Okay, boys, we know what the Commandant said he wants, but this is just, the cost is too much in manpower and money. We don't know what, so we're just going to have to half step this down the road for as long as we can, and just wait until it'll go away. We're just going to have to outwait these. We're not going to." So a conscious decision was made to, and you have to understand, this is back in General Jones' commandancy when all this started. He wanted this. That General Jones, that commandant wanted this. And he was completely aligned with General Rumsfeld, or with Secretary Rumsfeld. But when you got into the secure conference room of the United States, of corporate United States Marine Corps, the chairman of the board was saying, "Nah, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this Special Operations Command thing." And so that, I actually saw, I saw inside baseball, but I actually saw where the foot was put down on the brake pedal by the Marine Corps on their participation in Special Operations Command. So that was kind of the beginning. So I knew going in there how the Marine Corps initially felt, and then I began to discern how SOCOM felt about having you guys come on deck. But that, you've heard the story a couple of times, but And it was just by a twist, and that didn't have anything to do with why I got selected to be on the board, because, at the command I was at then, they,
weren't aware.
Yeah, and it's not something I really ever talked about until after the Court of Inquiry, because I just, but in the Marine Corps, you don't disobey the Commandant. He's friggin' God. That's the first time I ever saw that kind of blasphemy, is they were deliberately going against the wishes of the Commandant of the Marine Corps. First time I ever saw it, last time I ever saw it.
Now, some of that, who's the boss type of situation, when the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the convening authority, they actually put this protective order so that we wouldn't talk to anybody, but it's stated in there that, just like the JAG instruction states on courts of inquiries, that it's supposed to be fair, impartial, and biased. And then you were actually in the courtroom, the commander from the convening authority who wrote that originally, which was General Mattis, and then it later changed to Lieutenant General Helen, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps saying this is how it should proceed. But those that are presenting, and I remember one of the defense attorneys had mentioned during his initial arguments that what the court was about ready to hear was, the government is supposed to be presenting the facts, not creating the fact. Because when you try to create facts, you usurp the laws of our society when people are trying to twist facts. So, but when you were in the courtroom and you started hearing testimony, what were some of the thoughts in your head as far as what had gone on in Afghanistan and what the government's attorneys were presenting?
Well, yeah, one thing is, they were in there acting like like prosecutors, and
not fair, impartial, and biased.
Well, no, it's not fair, impartial, and biased, because that's just what. First of all, that's how lawyers are. It's like, I don't want to be unfair to lawyers, because you never want them around till you need one. But I've always had heartburn with prosecutors in the Marine Corps, because the whole thing doesn't seem fair to me. And so, they were just behaving like prosecutors. And, some of the questions he answered, you could tell, bothered me and the other board members, because the way we interrupted quite often. And so they were, I was never, to me, the prosecutor, the guys representing the government, I'm just going to call them prosecutors just to make it easy. They were at
the transcript. It says prosecutors.
Is that what it says? Yeah. They really didn't have a prosecutorial job. So it was just, they had to ask counter questions, and because the beauty of it is that we were asking questions as even the lawyers that you're would be defense lawyers, even those, the three of us were not lawyers, and so quite frankly, the most important questions in the room were the ones we were asking, because we were the ones that were going to sit there and try and figure this mess out. And we got exasperated with the lawyers on both sides, but more exasperated with the lawyers who were acting in a prosecutorial role. And I have to be real careful speaking for my two counterparts on the Court of Inquiry, but I don't think it's unfair to say that, I know that I was, and I think my two contemporaries on the board were, as Marines, not amused by some of the questions and theories that were kind of thrown out on the table by the prosecutors. And I think that one of the things that the prosecutors likely forgot was that we weren't a regular impaneled jury, and we weren't we weren't your average run-of-the-mill Marine sitting there. It's like
About
not to be
90 years of experience.
90 years of experience, and I mean a whole bunch of operational experience, and between the three of us, we had a lot of salt on our shoulders, quite frankly, and it was our job to figure things out. And what these guys were saying, yeah, okay, but we interrupted a lot, as you may recall, and sometimes I think the other two, Colonel Sloat and Colonel O'Rourke, enjoyed it. I loved the times that I could interrupt it. Now, just a minute when I could interrupt a lawyer, and I think we did that more to the prosecutors, just because I don't like to see Marines pick on other Marines. It's bullshit. So, yeah, I think they have to be there. I agree with you about fair and impartial, because they certainly weren't fair and impartial. They were behaving as if they were arguing a case, which they weren't. There was no case. We were just to argue. We were inquiring into the circumstances of what happened out there. That was it. It's it's in youthful enthusiasm. I look at it, because they were young. They were fairly the one guy was a major and the other guy was a captain.
They're both majors.
Were they both?
Oh
yeah, the assistants were
lieutenants.
That's right. So and then the world has changed. There's a lot more lawyerly stuff going on nowadays than what you would normally be used to. I think 40 years ago, those lawyers. 40 years ago, you would never have been in that room, all things being equal. We were talking about big boy rules, but those lawyers would have been tempered a little bit, and what I found, and I don't want to sit in here and play Monday morning quarterback 10 years after the fact, but I think there was a senior lawyer in the room, and looking back on it, knowing what I know now, he probably could have reined them in a little bit more than he did at times. So, right. But
in that officer who you're just describing, he was present in a lot of the interrogations that NCIS, as well as prosecutors, the colonel,
yeah.
the Marine full bird colonel, who was providing a legal advisor role, senior Marine legal advisor, but it came out, our Marines had been reporting back to defense attorneys that there was some, during some of these interrogations that NCIS was conducting, that, Marine officers were present and threatened, that they could order them, or that they were, and as well, other times saying they were threatening that they would have to take polygraphs, knowing that this Marine in question was of Latino descent, and that's the one who they were continually trying to pressure, knowing that if you take a polygraph in your non-native language, it can easily show deception. And then another Marine was threatened to be deported, have his family deported, if he did not sign their statement, which had all occurred. And I know to us, sitting on the other side of it is the defense. When those events were going on during the investigation phase, when our Marines were being interrogated in that manner, we seriously felt that before we had ever even gone to trial, we felt that we were going to go to jail for the rest of our lives at a minimum when Marines were being brought in and interrogated in this way. Because it was obvious that the Marine Corps is not trying to prove our innocence or allow us to, state our case in court. It was it was known to myself, as I've never been in a trial, but it was that it was very adversarial, even though it was said not to be, and that it was going to be impartial. But when our Marines were reporting those types of things, with this senior colonel lawyer present, and they'd report that back to the defense attorneys, and they even stated that in a court of inquiry during some questioning that's on. If you go to Nick Kaufman's SOFREP articles, some of those names are redacted, but it states in regards to this senior colonel, said when you were in the interrogation room, so you did sit in on these. That's a matter of fact on the courtroom records. There's sworn testimony in the trial, but I definitely knew that I felt that we were going to spend the rest of our lives in jail, and that, like with myself and the one other defense, the co-defendant, if we went to jail, most likely the other 5 would as well, and we were kind of on trial, and we thought there'd be other trials following that. But sir, during the trial, you heard a lot of testimonies. What were some of the things that changed? You said you'd read a lot of evidence, and before we went into trial, that kind of probably put a lot of ideas in your head as far as what the outcome was. These were senior officers, and then what were some of the things that were some of the aha moments when you're in the trial?
Well, I think there are a lot of aha moments, and it was started reading some of the classified documents. It's had nothing to do with live testimony. I'm reading these classified documents and I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound quite like what you read open source and maybe just a little bit on the SIPRNet, because I had the capability to delve into some.
And some who haven't listened to his previous testimony or the previous podcast, senior intelligence officer at the highest level Marine Command on the East Coast for the operational Marine Forces. So he had not just the experience of, at this point, about 30 years, but the access to a lot of this information.
Yeah. So, you got, there was, just for example, take the ballistics expert, right? So remember,
Yes.
You asked the ballistic expert, well, where were the bullets made? That he examined. Well, he didn't know where the bullets were made. And so the bullets that you used for an example, where were they made? Well, they were made such and such, I forget where it was, someplace in the United States. I said, well, were the bullets that were made, that were used in the ambush, were they made in Israel? Were they made in Belgium? Were they made in the U.S.? Where were they made? Do you know? No. So, and did you ever ask the question about where the bullets were made? No, I didn't even know they made them in Belgium or Israel, whatever. Well, I know for a fact that we were using those bullets in Afghanistan made from those different countries. So that was a breakdown because it's the thoroughness of an investigation just from that ballistics expert, right? So that's one thing. Okay.
And one ballistics expert determined that the impacts on the second vehicle
of the
were from a Soviet Dragunov sniper rifle, which the Air Force, unlike yourself who had knowledge from prior combat deployment, the Air Force colonel, who was a preliminary investigator, opined that we had shot our own vehicles.
Yeah, exactly.
And we never had Soviet sniper rifles.
Right, and why would you, well, never mind. We know why you would do it, but you didn't do it. And so you had that, and then, you started getting these witnesses who had been doing, like the Air Force colonel. His testimony was inconsistent with the facts of what we had in other documents. And so it was like, did you look here for this? Or did you, which any lieutenant in the Marine Corps doing his second investigation would know where to look.
Yes.
And so you saw that his investigation from a procedural standpoint was flawed and lazy. But disturbingly is that left out very important facts. The one sergeant's, he was an EOD sergeant, I believe. But anyway, he had left out that guy's statement to him because it didn't back up the conclusion that he wanted to find.
And he actually tried to convince him to change.
Exactly, and he wrote a statement saying that he was uncomfortable with it. So the further down the road we got, you found that the questions you would ask in a thorough investigation weren't being asked, and even the ballistics expert, who had no motive. He was just a ballistics expert, and he wasn't on the defensive or anything. When I asked him about where these bullets were made, did you look at where the bullets manufactured? Because that, and it can cause a difference in ballistics. It was just, he was using a standard bullet, and so that is seemingly a minor thing, but it's a major thing from the point of view is this guy had nothing to do with anything else except talking about ballistics, and there's four types of four manufacturers of 5.56 ammunition for NATO forces, and they're used in Afghanistan. He only looked at one, but they never determined where the ammunition came from that was being used. So you had that, and then you had the inconsistency of the investigation where evidence was given not being used. You had one, I don't know when your liaison officer, when we interrogated him or when we questioned him, yeah. So I mean, everything that guy touched turned to shit. Quite frankly, is a complete incompetent, just an awful excuse for a Marine. I'm not even going to say Marine officer, and I feel bad by even calling him a Marine. But there were just so many witnesses on the witness stand who performed shoddy investigations, or in the case like the ballistics expert, shoddy experiments. They didn't answer the questions they needed to ask. They didn't follow through. They didn't include exonerating testimony. It was a shambles. And you saw all of this. And so, it didn't take long. I think it was probably the second or third day that I was just, this is a mess. And
it's interesting that you mentioned that the liaison, that he was another Marine officer, same rank as me. He's supposed to be advocating for us back in Bagram, Afghanistan, in theater, sitting there with the higher headquarters, the Army Green Beret colonel, advocating. He's supposed to be helping us out. He flew in there early ahead of our task force arrival, and much like in the battle, or not the battle, during this time of, we've just described in a previous podcast with Valley Forge, one of General Washington's contemporaries, General Horatio Gates, was, you could call it envy, jealous, but he wanted to be in charge, the commander-in-chief of the Army, so he was doing everything possible to sabotage, General Washington and his efforts, and everything that he needed, he withheld. And very similar, and at least in my mind, you had a peer going dead set against General Washington, in my case, everything that fellow Marine major.
Yeah, no, the liaison officer was, he was out for himself.
Internal assassin.
He was looking for promotion. He needed some good paper because he had failed for selection the year before, so he was looking to get promoted. He was, I didn't get into full details, but he was a narcissist. and he was very much looking out for himself, and so much so, in fact, that he wrote his own fitness report, and as I recall, his own award. Did he? So,
He admitted it.
yeah, and so, but he admitted to this, on the witness stand. So that's something, Fred. This guy was a narcissist, and he was jealous, and there was no way, shape, or form this guy had any business sitting in Fred's position. The guy was, I don't even know if he was an intelligence officer, but I don't even know if he had gone to IOC. And I mean, so the bottom line is, it was just, Fred was dealing with a jealous contemporary, and he was just one more officer, one more bad officer in the mix. You had the liaison officer, you had the JSOTF, the Joint Special Operations Task Force Commander, Army Colonel Special Forces guy, who, quite frankly, he was exhausted and was only looking, exhausted and indifferent, and only looking to get out, to close the door and go home for a few months.
Leaving the same month.
Yeah, he was. I mean, he was done. He didn't. And then you had back in the States, you had an Army General, Deputy Special Operations Commander, Ranger, heavy Ranger background, who was political, didn't want the Marines in Special Operations Command, was looking for his next star, and he was extraordinarily nervous. What I took away from reading the emails, and you can say whatever you want to about how you, but I've read enough emails, and in this case, this situation in particular, he just looked to be a nervous Nelly. Oh my, he was so worried about how this looked.
And at that time, there were a lot of concurrent war crimes investigations, especially on the Marine side, but the Army also had, so the Marines had Haditha and Hamdaniya, and the Army, one that this Army general specifically knew himself about, was involving a former Army Ranger, Patrick Tillman, and that was on its fifth investigation. The mother of, the Gold Star mother, Mary Tillman, demanded answers as to what went on in her son, Corporal Patrick Tillman's death, who had played in the NFL, voluntarily left and served as an Army Ranger and was killed by friendly fire. She wanted to know the truth. So that was known, not just in the Ranger community, but in special operations, and especially the commanding general, who's in charge of all special operations, which the Rangers are included, in the Middle East. This general who, so you have this kind of a backdrop on this canvas that a lot of people were being, senior officers were getting relieved and in trouble because they didn't investigate completely enough and quickly enough. And so it's in some people's minds, because they found in the Patrick Tillman case that knowledge of things that were different than the facts and the truth had gone all the way up to the White House. And so it made sense to immediately conduct an investigation.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get in trouble to investigate. And that's how some people think, but it doesn't really translate well for people who are trying to fight a war to win it on the battlefield if they know they're always going to be investigated.
Well, and the problem here, too, was that somewhere along the line, the investigators decided that Fred and his Marines were guilty. And so that's how they were going to write their investigations. But there were some other officers, too. So we had, just real quick, so we had the Marine Corps Major Liaison Officer. We had the Air Force, who was Chief of Staff at SOCOM.
Special Operations Command Central.
Yeah. You had that guy who was, who was the investigator. You had the Special Operations Command Central Commanding General, and you had the JSOTF Commander.
Army Colonel Green Bray.
And then you had the Army Colonel Task Force Spartan
Conventional Commander.
But had a Ranger, a heavy Ranger background, who, to me, Fred's got a lot of people that he can point the finger to, but to me, this guy, this Task Force Spartan commander, he was the worst officer. He was the worst integrity breacher of them all. So you had that guy, we talked about him earlier, and then we had the Lieutenant Colonel, Naval Academy graduate, used to carry the suitcase around.
Battalion commander.
We're trying not to, but the MARSOC, the MSOB, Marine Special Operations Battalion commander. That guy,
he testified.
He
heard his testimony.
He testified, and I don't think that he. Let me just say this about him. He came off as an extraordinarily arrogant individual. It seems as if it was beneath his dignity and a waste of his time to be in a courtroom, and he clearly testifying, and he clearly had some sort of personal animus toward Fred Galvin. And, although as I recall his testimony, he didn't, there wasn't anything in there that could be found to be lies or lack of integrity or something. But there was just something really fishy about him. He was an extraordinarily, even the guys who I thought were liars or lacked integrity, they weren't as much of a fishy, fidgety witness as this guy. So there was something going on with the MSOB commander, and I think a lot of that had to do with personal animus toward Fred, which affected his professional relationship with Fred. Because he's the guy who wrote your fitness report, right? As I recall?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So there was something going on there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but just, there was something bad. So you had all these officers, and the majority of them service academy graduates. And I just, I came out of there thinking to myself, that's bad juju. And are we getting our, what are we producing in the service academies? And one of the takeaways for me personally in the big scheme of things, besides the fact that Fred and his Marines are innocent of any charges thrown at them, is the fact that that turned me against the service academies. If you have that many people that are that bad a product, what are we paying for? But yeah, you talk about a perfect storm of officer integrity breakdown.
And all those gentlemen have ascended to promotion and especially command.
Yeah, well, except for the liaison officer. If there's any justice in this,
and he wasn't an academy grad.
He was not, correct.
But all the academy grads.
All the academy grads were promoted.
And assigned commands.
Yep, that's true.
Very good billets, or was it? I'm assuming they wanted to. So it is very opposite. And I know you have, for the past 10 years since the trial, immediately after the trial, and we had no prior connection, and I hadn't reached out to yourself, but you'd contacted me over the phone at work, and he was stationed in Virginia and is there in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, but constantly, periodically calling me to ask about the health, because he knew this kind of situation, which hadn't even been decided. I'm not sure when, because it was 4 months until the official statement came down, but you're always checking to see if our Marines were doing okay, how they were doing. And it was surprising, and the reason I remember that is nobody from our command ever did. One other gentleman that you and I have become friends with, he had done this the year before in 2007, shortly after the ambush, and that's Congressman Walter Jones. Again, none of our families, none of us directly or indirectly through any affiliation, contacted or connected with him. He knew what had happened was unjust and that people shouldn't be commenting on things. There should be the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. But both of you gentlemen are still to this day working diligently. I can't even describe the number of hours and the number of figurative miles that you've marched to see that the Marines who honorably fought on 4 March in that ambush are known, that the truth is known, that it's not distorted. And we really truly appreciate that very much.
No, we're glad to do it. I mean, I'm not speaking for Congress. I'm glad to do it. We're going to win. It's like I believe in Congressman Jones. You just don't give up. But we're getting close to the end of this podcast here. I just I do want to ask your audience, if you want to really find out about this. Fred and I were lucky to spend some time with 2 writers. Andy DeGrandpre wrote a really good series of articles a few years back. In fact, won a prestigious award for it. And so he's one guy. And then Nick Kaufman for sofrep.com wrote some good articles. And Fred provided him a lot of formally classified documents that, able to get through the FOIA process. So I would just encourage your viewers here just to type in MARSOC 7, MARSOC, the number 7, and a lot of stuff will come up. But those 2 articles, if you really want to get some background
from the Military Times, Andy DeGrandpre and Nick Kaufman's articles with SOFREP will explain a lot of so much of the details are in there, and they both did a good job because they not only got our side of the story out, but what was different than the whole year long from when we were ambushed until we went to the courtroom, the news media had provided just one-sided information, and we were never asked, and our side never came out until after I was retired, and several members of the media had ran articles, some even stating by name, using my name, saying that we, at that point, and when I retired in 2014, stating that we, killed, multiple Afghan civilians. So I, decided it's time to correct the record with these people, and it still continued after was communicating to members of the media. Others would still launch this. So the moral of the story is, there's still the assumption with many people that Marines have done something illegal that's punishable. It's a capital offense, and that every country and religion in the world believes is punishable, often in most places by death. But you have fought with Congressman Jones and spent not just your time, but he's flown to provide press conferences and spent a lot of his time and money out of pocket, shoulder to shoulder with Congressman Jones and myself, getting the news out, working on a House resolution, which you can go to H.RES.21 and here in this 115th Congress and look that up and contact your members of Congress and tell them that this should be something that they need to co-sponsor and vote yay for. And it really needs to be clear, because I think you realize, and the reason you were contacting me is there's an understanding that generation for generations that can haunt Marines and their families, and it doesn't just affect us right now and the quality of life and Marines not being able to get jobs, which is a very serious issue that demoralizes Marines, but it affects their children and grandchildren with this black cloud that's modern phrase is fake news, and but that really seriously impacts the lives of men who fought, and currently there's a new generation out there, men and women who are fighting, who see this as an example and approach war with hesitation. There's that thought in the back of their mind that something like this could happen, and that's why we've entered our 17th year of war in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of incentives not to fight aggressively or to pursue their job, whatever role they're serving, if something like this could be brought up as a question. So, but what other items during the trial or afterwards do you see that need to be addressed?
Well, we got to take care of you and your Marines. That's important. And part of that is I got to be careful how I say it. I don't want to come off like I'm being vindictive, but I'm really not pleased that the actions of the former Task Force Spartan commander and the former SOC CENT commander, long after the fact, projecting the story that they wanted to project, even though the Court of Inquiry completely contradicts them.
And they knew about it, and they're going around on lecture circuits, or these are proven facts, and providing, I don't want to say testimony, but talking to authors and writing books
about this incident as if it happened as originally presented.
Even when they admitted contrary, one of these officers in sworn testimony.
Yeah. So that's the thing, I want your Marines to be taken care of, but part of the justice that has to be gotten is these guys need some justice because they breached their integrity as officers in a very bad way. I mean,
and been rewarded for it.
Exactly. But, to me, the most important thing here is, we got to continue to fight until we win and get the proper exoneration for the MARSOC 7. That's the most important thing. The other stuff, if that doesn't happen, it doesn't. But
not in this life.
Yeah.
But,
Valhalla, like I say, Valhalla. So, yeah, I mean, it's it's just a sad tale. But you've got your integrity intact. Your Marines have their integrity intact. That's the important thing. And the Marine Corps, I think with Congressman Jones' help, the Marine Corps is gonna come around. May not be next week, but they will come around.
And again, listeners, that's something that every one of you, as well as all your contacts that you have, you can circulate that House Resolution 21. You can web search it on Google, H.RES 21, and really. It means a lot for our Marines to have their names completely and officially cleared once and for all, so that they can live the lives and their families can enjoy the quality of life that they do deserve for fighting heroically and doing what they were called to do. So please contact your congressman or congresswoman today and urge them to co-sponsor House Resolution 21 and to vote yay for it when it comes on. Sometimes congressmen want to see which way the wind blows. Try not to allow your member of Congress to do that, so that we can see this victory here in short order and Marines are able to go on with their lives. It does affect the Marines, the 7 of us who were falsely accused. So, any words?
I think that's it, Fred. Thanks for having me on, and appreciate your kind words for me. And I think we had a great time yesterday at Christmas. So it was really a good visit, and I enjoyed doing this. It
was a special treat. His brother cooked this incredible Christmas meal. It'd make any Viking blush. It was a very hearty meal, and tell your brother Patrick I truly am indebted and grateful. It was delicious. And thank you very much, Commandos, for tuning in. I will say this about retired Lieutenant Colonel Morgan. He one of the things here on the Go Commando show is as a Marine, we want to get to the naked truths. That's what Going Commando is all about, is you strip it all away and you get down to those naked truths, what actually happens. And it's very refreshing to be sitting side by side with a retired Marine, not just because we both share that bond of brotherhood from service and the battlefield, but that you call it exactly like it is, and you are someone who has a reputation and is well known that you don't care if it offends anybody. You're just going to get to the raw truth, and I like that plain, unvarnished, raw, naked truth. So thank you very much once again, sir. And
Happy New Year, Fred.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you too. Thanks, Commandos. Have a great evening.
To all my fellow grunts out there who in your youth felt it was your duty to protect us, I salute you. And thanks to the listeners of the Go Commando Show who labor on the farm, who are sweating on the construction site, putting forth your very best at the office. You are making a difference. Support the Go Commando Show in our pursuit of bringing you the highest quality professionals. Infiltrate the website at gocommandoshow.com, where you can view all of the podcasts and arm your team with incredible deals on health supplements, commando clothing, and equipment. Every time that you get a good deal, it supports the show. What deals? When you purchase anything from the website, Amazon, healthcare supplements, you're covering our six. And to the ladies on the team, when you outfit yourself in the super sexy threads from Naked Zebra, and yes, I'm talking about in fuego, you are firing the sniper shot for our commandos. How else can you support? It's simple. You smash the follow and subscribe buttons on our social media. That is how you support us bringing great guests to talk about serious subjects, not the mainstream media's fake news. So thank you, and until our next show, stay in the attack and go Commando.